Alright, gang, we are 45 seconds early. Let's go ahead and get started. And hopefully get into a good position to blast off to Thanksgiving break, which, if I'm not incorrect, is all of next week. Alright, cool. We used to have to go through this whole dog and pony show of canceling classes on Monday and Tuesday of Thanksgiving week because nobody would show up anyway. But now that it's sort of automatic, it's nice, it's very efficient. And we are nothing if not ruthlessly efficient in state government. All right, cool. So, any announcements for the good of the cause? Any extra credit opportunities? Anybody have any questions about alternative field trip options? Anything like that? Otherwise, we'll jump back into our water resources, in particular how to manage those in a recreation context for conservation and human health and safety. In that case, let's rock and roll. So we left off last time talking about waste in recreation settings, talking about composting toilets, privies, which are backcountry outhouses. So we want to nuance that as a backcountry toilet is a facility that you build and maintain and sunset and occasionally have to dig out or move. When it's just like a pit toilet way off in the woods somewhere. When it fills up, you gotta deal with that. And that is a challenge, right? So nobody that I'm aware of gets excited about forestry specifically for the task and purpose of, like, you know, digging poop chutes deep in the forest or way high up on a mountain and so forth. With the right attitude, anything is an adventure. But generally speaking, that's not why people get into forestry, right? So it is a management decision on your part this semester for your national park when we're dealing with any of our, scenarios in the last week of class along the lines of, all right, so visitation has doubled or tripled over the last decade, as it has in a lot of national parks following the pandemic. And people are pooping in too many places, or there's just too much fecal matter in terms of nutrient loading or biological risk or pathogen payload like E. coli we were talking about on Monday. So it is a non-trivial decision to decide our trail network needs toilets at the far end, right? It's relatively easy for us to bid out, those poured concrete bathroom structures like we saw on our field trip at Devil's Well of Ozark Scenic Riverways. And, to have a local septic pumping truck service come by every month or so, pump that out, keep things nice and copacetic and fresh smelling, and so on and so forth, right? We got lots of sort of templated designs for that kind of stuff. It's kind of a turnkey project, meaning you don't have to do a whole lot of thinking. You just import the project blueprints and get the site engineer and make sure the hydrology is compatible with having a concrete vault pit toilet there. And you just kind of go and, concrete structures last a really long time, especially under light, human-only traffic use instead of something like a road. So that's not a big deal. But in the backcountry, this is a much bigger decision because if you and your trail boss or trail crews, or you're on the trail crew, you're the person tasked with servicing this thing every season, there's a lot more calculus involved, right? So when our trails are taking our visitors into parts of a forest ecosystem or a subalpine ecosystem or an Arctic or subarctic ecosystem that might have low nutrient cycling, low soil microbe activity to digest those feces and turn them into soil compounds, then we need to have a conversation of, all right, is the best move here to focus people who need to poop onto some track that takes them to either a simple pit toilet, which we're going to cap and fill in and move when it's at the end of life. So we pick up the privy structure, move it 10 feet to the side, dig another pit hole, and move it for the next decade and so forth. Do we want to put an above-ground composting toilet system into place? And we need to select a composting system that is either hot or room temperature. We're going to have to stock that with, depending on the composting availability of aerobic or anaerobic bacteria to break down those feces in that environment, we're going to have to provide wood shavings. We're going to have to provide maybe septic-safe toilet paper. We're going to have to maybe think about putting a sign on there that says, you can poop in here, but don't pee in here, because it's going to sterilize all these bacteria that are going to try and turn all of our feces into soil that we can distribute locally here, and it's not a big deal. You have to figure out, okay, if we are concentrating human feces on any kind of a slope, and we have a failure of this system, right? When a sewage containment pond in a North Carolina hog farm breaks or overflows or gets flooded by torrential rains. I don't know if you know this, but this fall, North Carolina had some torrential rains, and when that happens, big hog farms and their essentially their sewage ponds can overflow into local waterways and utterly sterilize the waterway down from that point for miles in some cases. Right? If you have 10,000 head of hog, that's a lot of feces. And that's a lot of nutrient recycling into protein in the form of the hog, but some of it's going to pass through the hog and have to be collected and disposed of. So we're dealing with the same kinds of things in asking this question of, okay, so all of our backpackers gotta poop. Are we going to ask them or force them to poop into a bag and carry it out? Can we provide some sort of specific facility and concentrate that biohazard, that waste, that nutrient content in one spot and manage it actively? Can we spread out, can we diffuse the issue of fecal and urine, solids and liquids? Can we spread that out sort of effectively on an ecological scale across the landscape? So, how many of you guys and gals have ever been backpacking? All right. When do you poop? Like on a typical day of backpacking. Is it first thing in the morning? Is it what gets you out of the tent? Is it the last thing you do before you turn in at night? Is it always when you stop for lunch and not at a campsite? Is it something in between? When do you poop? Serious question. I'll lead the charge. I'll break the ice. So, this is actually two different answers based on whether this is a short-term trip, like everybody's had a chance to go at the trailhead and we're good for probably 24 hours and so forth, versus when you're on a longer distance backpacking trip, the timing and dynamics are a little bit different. Because physical motion helps lubricate that system. Morning coffee helps very slightly irritate your GI system and sort of push things through. So if you've ever heard someone belly aching about, morning coffee poop shooting through them like a laser, that has a biological basis. And the only reason I'm asking when do we generally poop during a typical day or stereotypical day of backpacking is it doesn't matter when you or I poop during the day. It does matter when 10,000 people across the same trail network in a single season, if they're all pooping at the same time of day, well, that's going to concentrate that spatially on the map. Instead of spreading it out evenly where, if everybody's digging their little cat holder feces disposal site in a different spot in the woods, that's okay. That's ecologically transparent in a mesic, mid-successional forest like we might have here in the southern Midwest. Just shy of the alpine zone on Long's Peak, for example, in Colorado, or any of the Rockies in Wyoming, for example, right? We don't have the ability of Thompson Woods to essentially bacteriologically digest those human feces away. So if everybody is getting to camp and throwing down their tents and letting their sleeping pads self-inflate and stuff like that, and having a snack and then pooping right after that, if all 10,000 of our visitors that season on that trail network are doing that, then we have a feces spatial correlation, an overlap with our campsites, instead of everything spread out evenly across the space, right? So 99 plus 90% of visitors, hikers, for any arbitrary section of trail are going to be on that trail. But in that way, we can't assume that things are going to get spread out. So, all this to say, it's complex, right? We all have needs. We all have motivations and desires to have a backcountry pop up the squat in scenic places, right? And so we have this line of sight issue. What if a lot of people get the idea to Pontacrunk, take a hudge, lay that pipe, whatever, or if you're having a bad day, Hershey squirts. You know, if everybody gets the same idea to do that in a spot with a really nice view, what other places, how many other campsites nearby can see that spot, right? We all tend to have the same good ideas for the same reasons in approximately the same places and or the same stages of a day's hike. So, all this to say, it is a non-trivial issue. We can't just send everybody out on your trail network and assume that everything's going to be fine. And your visitors will start to let you know, man, we had a really nice hike, except for the fact that, like, everywhere you can pull off to the side of the trail and look at this vista point or whatever, 6 feet past the edge of each of those clearings, each of those vista points or whatever, there's toilet paper. There's a little pile of rocks with a stick sticking out of it, and man, you can't step foot outside of the trail or outside of these spots where everybody is throwing down their pack and having lunch, for example, or scrambling around on the cliff edge and maybe doing some bouldering or taking that cell phone photo or whatever. Like, you go one step past that and it's a minefield. So that's kind of a trip ruining thing for some people. It's really, really off-putting to think, gosh, I can't wait to lay my head down on this rocky soil 10 feet from 5 different piles of human feces because previous visitors didn't move far enough away from the campsite to conceal their waste. So all that to say, right, we have to confront the question of basic human biological needs and creature comforts and deal with those. And the answers can be distributed across the system, can be a composting toilet, a non-composting pit toilet, we'll call those privies, or we can force people to rely on trailheads and figure the rest out themselves. Okay? So, managing health risks in terms of water impacts. Now, this is an impact to human health, so again, that biological, that viral, bacteriological, protozoan type issues. This is not a large-scale problem on a global scale. It is kind of an intense problem because, well, if our campsite is laid out to where the most obvious brainless place to sneak outside of the campsite and poop after morning coffee or whatever, if that is upslope from that campsite's water source, right, we're going to have a very significant portion of the nation's statistics for whatever people are pooping out into that water source downslope. Okay? So again, the absolute magnitude of this risk is small. The exposure to this low magnitude risk is very high in a forest recreation, typically a backcountry context. Okay? So, professionally, when we're thinking about risk management, and how to make decisions on, well, Park told me that Campylobacter is a thing, but I don't know, like, do we follow everybody along the trail and make sure they're not pooping? Do we just trust people? Like, what do we do? For risk, we are looking at assigning some quantitative value, some number to the severity, the intensity. How bad is it going to be if this hand grenade goes off in my hand? Pretty bad, right? So high intensity or high severity of risk. And then how likely is that severity to happen or not? So we multiply these two numbers together. So to numbers less than 1. Right? So the severity might be for each person that gets some new superbug in backpacking water sources, each person that contracts that, they die. 100% fatality rate. So 100% or 1. Pretty severe. Then the exposure is, what's the percent chance that you're going to get it in the first place? Once you get it, you have a 100% chance that you're going to die. But what's the chance that you get it, right? So this is the kind of math that epidemiologists, that public health managers, that mask manufacturers are trying to grapple with in respect to COVID-19. And I'm working on a research project right now with APHIS to figure out when we transmit COVID to deer and deer mutate that COVID potentially and then transmit it back to humans, what is our severity of that? Having a new strain of COVID that maybe our vaccines don't work so well against, versus how likely is it for someone to contaminate a population of deer, for the deer to multiply and mutate that COVID as a reservoir species, and then spread it back to humans in its new form. Right? So, not a 100% chance that any arbitrary person is going to give COVID that they have to a deer. Less than 100% chance that a deer is going to mutate it, and less than a 100% chance that a deer is going to give it back to a human successfully. Or successfully is the wrong word for contagion. Anyway. This is the math that we're working at, where something like Giardia is pretty heinous. Kind of rhymes when you think about it. Giardia is pretty heinous at exploding your anus and your esophagus with ejecta. It's rough stuff. But not everybody who goes hiking picks up Giardia. And not everybody who picks up Giardia ends up dying from it. In fact, very few people do these days. So, relatively low risk of exposure times a relatively low severity of dying, for example, means that we have a really low risk. The reason that we kind of geek out and try to assign numbers to this is that you and I and everybody of all of human history, we are all notoriously bad at accurately estimating our risk for something like this. We are really, really, really bad. Which is why we saw some people in the last 4 years really freaking out about COVID, and a lot of people completely dismissing COVID as a thing and wearing their mask as a so-called chin diaper instead of a functional contagion control. So, like, that's human nature, right? This is not anything that anybody needs to be ashamed about. It's just, as a professional in the field, you and I need to think about this in slightly more effective, accurate terms, and that means mathematics. So it's just a percent severity and a percent likelihood that it could happen. So you're going to hear a lot of risk statistics over your lifetime expressed in terms of deaths per 100,000 population, okay? Or birth rate, right? Population replacement for humans is 2.1 offspring on average per family, per couple, to keep the human population at a steady size. And then of those births, some births will result in a non-viable fetus or a non-viable infant, and some will kill the mom, right? So epidemiologists, public health experts, they're looking at what's the number out of 100,000 humans, how many births, for example, are ending up in mom dying or the baby dying or both. And then we get a sense of the widespreadness, the exposure of that, we already know the severity is as bad as it gets, right? So, human birth health is a pretty fraught thing. So, be grateful for healthcare. All right. I think we've sort of beat this to death. Moving on. So, in 1995 to 1996, we had 37 outbreaks from 17 states attributed to recreational water exposure, affecting an estimated 9,129 people, including 8,449 people in 2 large outbreaks of cryptosporidiosis, which is cryptosporidium-based illness. And that's thousands of people whose lives are affected temporarily, right? This is not generally fatal for most recreational outbreaks, but that's a pretty great way to ruin your trip. So, all this to say, we pay attention to where people are pooping so that we have a clear sense of where people are at much higher exposure. Right? So if it's 1 in 100,000 people are likely to get cryptosporidium on average across everybody, it might be 1 in 50 people using a particular water source along a trail, right? So if the severity is fixed, it's cryptosporidiosis. But the exposure is much, much higher in the spot that we are managing for human recreation purposes, then that's why we pay a lot of extra attention to these, okay? So, when you have a rain event, what that physical impact of each raindrop in the soil bank, or the bank soil column next to, right, close to each water source or water feature flowing or still water like a pond or lake, the rain stirs up that stuff, basically the biological dust of lots of little microbes, worms, parasites, all sorts of stuff. Rain events move those things to the surface and put those contaminants, those risk factors, back into the water column from which they had previously settled back out. So we tend to see clusters in space, hotspots on the map where Spring is getting a lot of people sick. And those hotspots tend to have some kind of close follow-on lag effect on the order of hours to a day or two following relatively major rain events. Okay. And as a result, the reservoir of things that can make you sick, like E. coli, crypto, Giardia lamblia, right, 10 to 100 times more concentrated in the soil, and then you stir up that soil just at the surface is enough to essentially recontaminate a water source or crank that exposure factor way, way, way up, and so forth. Kayakers are an excellent sort of study population for this. So any of you guys at your national park, do you have paddle craft in a lake or along the shore? All right, so this is gonna not be an everybody thing, but it's a useful sort of thought experiment. So the base rate for gastrointestinal problems is about 20% in the general population. You have a 1 in 5 chance of having, like being sick with something in the general population. So if we just sampled all across everybody one time, just as a one-off thing, we'd find about 1 in 5 people having at least a bit of a tummy ache. Kayaking in water with E. coli levels that are cranked up, so 100 E. coli organisms per 100 milliliters. 100 milliliters is like a fraction of a cup. That increases that sickness rate by 50%, from 20% up another 10% to 30%, 50% increase. Okay? So, that's a big jump, right? We pay attention to if the deaths from heart attacks go up by 0.5% in a year, everybody's freaked out. Oh my gosh, this is going to affect millions of people, right? And something much more specific in terms of the population that you're looking at, kayaking in your national park, well, man, we get people sick 50% harder than just existing otherwise. That's not great. So you don't want your park to be attached to a reputation of nasty health hazard level water. When we were at Sino Canal National Historic Park in Washington, D.C. on summer camp this past year, we talked about just briefly what it was like to kayak in the massive whitewater features of that river just outside of the National Mall area. That part of the Potomac is fairly far downriver, and it is draining the sewage effluent, the discharge of thousands and thousands of upstream septic leach fields from homes. Municipal water treatment facilities will discharge their treated water into a waterway like this, and some of those places have E. coli levels so high you literally can't measure a raw sample out of that discharge stream. You have to dilute it down so that you can just count the number of cells that you see. That is miserable work. If you ever get summer work doing forest water quality monitoring by getting grab samples, some of those grab samples are going to be downstream from wastewater treatment plants, and it's nasty. I did that for 2 summers in college. Cannot recommend. Okay? So, we have an outstanding recreation opportunity. Hydraulics that can eat a house are pretty fun to kayak in when the water is high but not too high. Unfortunately, people are kind of taking their health into their own hands by enjoying that outdoor recreation opportunity. The thing is, you can't look at a river like the Potomac or the Big Muddy or any other river and tell visually how much E. coli is loaded into that water. You can't even make an educated guess on what the E. coli levels are in the Potomac River day on day, because if there was a big storm upstream, stirring up that sediment, stirring a bunch of E. coli back into the water column, and then flowing it through the area that you want to go kayaking in, right? The weather's fine, and yesterday's E. coli test was fine, and today it's off the charts high, but here we go, because yesterday's report looked fine. Does that make sense? Okay, so what this means for us as forest recreation managers is we got to stay on top of this stuff. Part of our staff on the science and resource management side of the staff at your national park, so microbiologists, water treatment engineers, we've got obviously everybody else like ornithologists, mammalogists, ichthyologists, etc., climatologists, everybody else, all the ologists working in the park. Some of that staffing power may need to go to monitoring for basic health and safety issues. Okay? So it's not all bad. Like I was kind of talking down about grabbing suburban and rural water samples from different watersheds back in college. One of our recent graduates, a guy named Chris, spent a couple of years working at the Grand Canyon in their water monitoring division, and his job was to backpack down into the canyon and download data off of stream gauging stations run by the United States Geologic Survey. They run a whole network of them all across the country. And just sort of sideload monitoring data from those streams in the Grand Canyon onto like a cell phone portable data recording device and then hike back out. That's a pretty good job, right? And what that monitoring, what that surveillance does is gives you this sense of, oh shoot, we're gonna have a really bad couple of days. We need to post just a little warning at the boat launch saying, hey, you know, if you're swimming in this water for more than 30 minutes or whatever, be sure to just take a shower and maybe like mouthwash out afterwards. Don't drink this water, okay? It's still safe to swim in and so on and so forth, as long as you don't have any like open wounds in which the, you know, pathogens can get in sort of through your skin organ, but yeah, okay? So, monitoring, surveillance, the name of the game. Constant testing of this stuff because these levels are really pretty dynamic. At Grand Teton National Park, there's a study looking at people going to the hospital in Jackson, Wyoming, a strange and bougie place. And Campylobacter was found in 24% of cases presenting diarrhea. Now, diarrhea is a very nonspecific symptom. It can be from a million different things. So the fact that a quarter of those cases are from a specific single recreation-associated water pathogen, that's about as close to a smoking gun as you're ever going to get in recreation epidemiology. Epidemiology is the study of the spread of disease. So no Salmonella, no Shigella, those are fine. And 3 out of 5 of those people who presented Campylobacter in pathogen tests back at the emergency room or whatever, they drank from specific mountain streams within the past 2 weeks, right? So there's that incubation period and so forth. So you start pulling out maps and marking where people went on their hikes, and you're looking for where the spaghetti map of each person's hiking trace, where those overlap, where those coincide with specific water sources, and then you send out, or you are the person sent out, to post a sign way off in the backcountry in some cases, saying, hey, this spring may be severely contaminated with the GI pathogen Campylobacter, right? You need to treat this water. And since Grand Teton is a high elevation park, boiling the water is not going to be enough in a lot of sections of that trail system there. It's not going to get that water hot enough to actually kill those organisms. So that sign at that spot says you need to boil this water and you need to chemically treat it with chlorine or another oxidant. Or you need to filter this with a nano ceramic filter that'll pull out bacteria and viruses. And we gotta communicate to everybody before they get on that trail, because once they're on that trail and we post warning information at the trailhead, well, if they didn't see that sign, they didn't know to pack a filter. And so they're just only able to boil that water, and boiling the water doesn't work real well up at that elevation. So, right, we gotta think through how can we catch everybody at the trailhead, at the moment of temptation to drink less treated water and so forth, where people are making an uninformed, a less skilled attempt at trying to sterilize their water and make it safe. Okay? So, Campylobacter only found in 2% of the water specimens taken. So, that's 1 out of 50 sites that we measure and screen for Campylobacter actually having detectable levels, at least when we did the searching, of that particular pathogen, right? So this could be a highly localized thing. If somebody's going on a week-long backpacking trip in the Teton Range, which is a pretty awesome deal, they're gonna cross a couple of hundred water sources. And if 2% of their water sources are contaminated with Campylobacter, their exposure level is not consistent with the general population. It is really, really, really high. They're drinking from that particular pool in the stream, or that particular seep, leaking down to the stream bed, whatever the water source is. Okay? Cool. All right. Let's keep the hits a-rolling. Lake Powell. Lake Powell's an artificial lake. It was dammed by Glen Canyon Dam just upstream from Grand Canyon. And as a result, it is a lake system with a very, very high edge to interior ratio. There's not a lot of like big spots where it's horizon to horizon Lake Powell. It's just not that kind of a lake, right? Most of our lakes in Illinois are the same way. Rend Lake is a very long, skinny lake because it was artificially created, and we're just looking at a filled-in stream bed through there, okay? So we have almost 2,000 miles of shoreline on this one created lake. How many thousands of miles of shoreline do we have in the continental United States? Not a lot more than that. Okay? So think about that in terms of the power that we have to alter our landscape in terms of water and water-adjacent resources like shoreline. Okay? Only 100 miles of that are suitable for camping because there are a whole bunch of cliffs. It's the head of Grand Canyon, right? There's a bunch of steep terrain all throughout there, and as a result, there's not a lot of soil in like bare bedrock walls and steep slopes around what is now the surface of Lake Powell, and so we just have a lot of places to bury those feces. And so the few places where folks could bury it in that thin sandy soil, right, it's going to be there for a long time, and those thin patches of sandy soils are going to fill up with human feces real fast, and all of the toilet paper that's not decomposing in that sandy soil and so forth, right? So as a result, the management response is not requiring, but strongly encouraging people to deal with it themselves, right? So if you're boating on Lake Powell, you need to have a chemical toilet. It's a 5-gallon bucket with a special lid that looks like a toilet seat. And then, you add a bunch of chemicals to it so it doesn't stink quite as bad, and get a sealing lid and so forth. And then we can, to the extent that there is soil along this 100-mile section where people are camping and so forth, so they're on the shore instead of the water, we can, and can is a dirty word in recreation management, we can have visitors bury their feces, bury their waste, at least 100 feet above waterline. Okay, so everybody look out the window and point at something that is 100 feet from you. You know what to point at? You guys are foresters. How many of you guys have taken forest measurements? All right, so we have some field-calibrated sense of linear distance, right? Point at something 100 feet away, not more, not less. Do you feel how hard and awkward this is? Now imagine you got to take a dump and you've never taken measurements. You don't have a calibrated sense of what 100 feet above high water line is. So what are you going to do? You're going to take that dump, because by God, this is America. And then everybody else afterwards gets to deal with the consequences of a possibly, potentially, maybe ill-considered hudge. Okay? So, when we surveyed people, asking folks, okay, so what did you actually do? And pair that with a little bit of discrete on-site surveillance to see if what people are self-reporting reflects reality, because often it doesn't, especially in a socially awkward topic like feces disposal, right? Less than 1 in 5 boaters were saying, yeah, I buried above high water. I took care of it that way. Because to get 100 feet above waterline, you might have to hike a lot more than 100 feet sideways. Does that make sense? You might be going for a long walk when you're doing that sort of weird, trying to pinch it off waddle, you know? And Lake Powell is absolutely, for valid reasons, a place where copious amounts of beer are consumed. So if you've ever had the beer shits, right, you know what that feels like, and you know what your boaters, and therefore everybody trying to stay safe and not infected by this water, is up against. All right? Haha. So, as a result, the Army Corps of Engineers, which runs Lake Powell and the thousands of miles of shoreline of this and many other water impoundments across the United States, they have to shut down these beaches. And that's a big deal, because when you shut down a beach where people have been RVing and jeeping and sand, dune buggying, sand railing, and sunning and playing volleyball and drinking copious amounts of beer and stuff like that, and you say, sorry, everybody gotta pull up stakes, pack it up, gotta go somewhere else. But somewhere else might be a 75-mile drive in terms of getting up off the lake and then going around the lake, which is a super long, complex, many-fingered thing in this canyon environment, to drop down to the next beach, right? Super, super unpopular. And in that moment, even when the risk is high, remember, there's this incubation lag period of a couple of weeks. So people are like, why are you closing down my beach? I feel fine. You feel fine. You feel fine. We all feel fine, officer. Would you like a beer? And it gets weird, right? So, unfortunately, we have to do a little bit of thinking for people. And I don't want to come across as condescending. I just want to remind us that we're all really bad at understanding risk effectively, meaningfully. So what your water quality technician getting grab samples and looking for fecal coliform and Campylobacter and all this stuff, what they're telling you is not what people's senses are telling them when they're at the beach playing volleyball, drinking beer, and water skiing out on Lake Powell. Right? So that dissonance, that disagreement between their obvious sensory inputs and what somebody from the government is trying to show up and tell everybody, right? The distance between what I see and what I'm being told, according to a body of theory called discrepancy theory, the bigger that gap is, the more uncomfortable that situation immediately becomes. We don't like ambiguity. We don't like things that don't jive with what we are seeing. And at Lake Powell, we're seeing a lot of good times. Okay? So, looking at the management possible options, and then looking downstream of what you and I can do as managers, as rangers on site, to the perceptual acceptability of the management actions that you and I can do in a case like this. A third of people said they didn't feel like they had any idea of what was going on with the sanitation facilities that were available to them. 68%, that is a large majority. When we see numbers like this in recreation management, like feedback, like surveys and stuff like that, like how are we doing kind of work, this is an oh my god, the roof is on fire kind of statistic. Okay, so Army Corps of Engineers does things in response. They bought very expensive, very ruggedized, essentially outhouses, and they're like Army surplus outhouses, so they're built different. It's a whole experience pooping at Lake Powell. Let me just wax grandiloquent about pooping at Lake Powell. Anyway, moving on. 40% of people, 40%, 2 out of 5, right? That's like more than one person in each family on average visiting Lake Powell said that, yeah, poop is at least a minor problem. Like, that's a lot of people. That's a lot of people. We're hoping for like less than single digits percentage of respondents saying stuff like this, right? So again, any of these statistics are, man, we have become decoupled from what is working. It is not working right now, okay? And crucially, 3 out of 4 visitors, which is about as high as you're ever gonna get in terms of government agency people, rangers, asking visitors what more could or should the government be doing in this place about this issue. 3 out of 4 people saying more controls are needed to prevent pollution, biological contamination on Lake Powell. Okay, this is what we would call a mandate from your visitors. They're saying, look, this is bad. We all see it, and we are okay with you kind of stepping in and doing some more heavy-handed management. So when we're talking about our strategies, right? Increasing supply in real or effective terms, modifying the resource to be less vulnerable to impacts or to spring back from impacts more readily, that is resistance or resilience, respectively. Where we're talking about the strategy of modifying our visitor use either directly by requiring people to use chemical toilets or indirectly by teaching them that feces at Lake Powell might be a problem and here are some options that you might choose from. Or the use limitation strategy of closing a beach down for a little while or permanently. Right? All of those are valid options. We are typically selecting from among our options along the lines of fastest, cheapest, low-hanging fruit option first. It's super easy to just print out a sign and say, hey, make sure to use the restroom on your way out to the beach. Make sure to plan for the long walk that it is to get from the beach to these restrooms. Super quick and easy. It's not really controlling anybody. It's not unpopular. It's not super expensive, right? We're just printing out some laser printer paper, maybe laminating it so it lasts in the rain and sun and so forth, and then getting the word out to folks. And we're working through our options ordered by fastest, cheapest, low-hanging to most odious or least acceptable to visitors. All right? So this is the process that we use to get from managing Lake Powell. People are at Lake Powell. People have to poop. Poop might have some nasty side effects. I've got some options on how to deal with this. What do I actually do? Okay? So that's kind of the big picture, the template or the structure through which we're moving through these issues at Lake Powell as one example, a case study. All right? So always take things by the easy handle, as President Thomas Jefferson once wrote, in between sleeping with his enslaved people servants. And then down at the bottom of the list, scorched earth, nuke it from orbit. It's the only way to be sure, right? You get real hardcore and you get in there and you fix stuff. People might not like it, but by God, you fixed it. Okay, cool. So that's about all the juice we can squeeze out of Lake Powell as a case study. So this is what swimming at Lake Powell can look like. Let's take a look at another quick case study at Voyageurs National Park. So Voyageurs is a northern tier park. It is heavily water-based, and it's a relatively young park as far as those go. It's about 100 years younger than Yellowstone is. Established in 1975, a little bit before we were born. And it's a relatively small, we wouldn't say it's the most extensive national park, certainly not taking into account anything in Alaska, all right? But it's right at the Canadian border, right? So it's like northern Minnesota, I believe, yeah. And it's beautiful canoeing, boating, camping, stuff like that, right? This is not real close to any huge metropolitan center, so you're up in the Great Wide North, right? The boreal forest is here. We're in the land of 1,000 lakes, and yeah, it is right on the border. And there's a Canadian counterpart to Voyageurs as well, and they're sort of co-managed internationally between Canadian national parks and American national park system. Pretty cool stuff, right? This is the land of beaver dams and loons and moose and bear and all kinds of stuff, right? So we've got float craft, even traditional uses. We've got motorcraft and ferries. We've got the Northern Lights, right? This is one of those more sort of interior to the United States, but relatively cool in the summer. And if you don't mind biting insects, man, go ham. Here. We stand Voyageurs. Okay. And unfortunately, this place is absolutely shot through with non-native invasive species brought in by all of this recreation over the years, right? So last week we were talking, or excuse me, on Monday we were talking about zebra mussels as a biological contaminant and non-native invasive species brought over from ecosystems in Asia where they have predators, they're kept in check, they're not a big deal over there. But here they're absolutely ravaging the Great Lakes and sort of moving out up the water web away from the Great Lakes in all directions. And just, man, they are collapsing ecosystems, right? So non-native aquatic invasive species can be a little bit harder to find, to track, to eradicate versus terrestrial stuff where we can just walk through the forest and do herbiciding or mechanical removal or hand pulling in a wilderness area. Aquatics are harder work. We can dump a bunch of chemicals into that water, but right, if we get the above the LD 50, so the lethal dose at 50% of the population concentration of some aquatic herbicide, and we're killing off all the fish, well, we've maybe gotten rid of the non-native, but also the native stuff too. Not great. So the idea is to focus on prevention, right? It just takes one. So prevention is a good press, but it doesn't really often work very well. It just takes one. Okay, so one example, we're gonna have a spiny water flea. Doesn't that look pleasant? Ugh. Horrible little monsters. And they are, they get into a water system and they alter or start to affect the entire food web around them, like zebra mussels. And so the management response, the strategy here, we're gonna try to reduce the impact of use. And we're going to try to reduce the impact of use by modifying the visitor-based inputs of these non-native invasive species to these otherwise pristine ecosystems. Okay? So that's going to be direct and indirect modification of visitor behaviors through rules and regulations, indirectly through information and education, and directly, definitely through law enforcement. Right? So we need to task our law enforcement rangers to have presence patrols around boat ramps and put-ins and takeouts and washing stations and make sure that they're actually being used. And from time to time, get a little bit assertive with folks who don't believe in the power of their dreams as far as keeping these non-native invasive species like these spiny fleas out of these lakes and ponds. Okay? And it's a lot, right? So we're going to arrange the rules and regulations, again, in the information education, which is generally pleasant and positive in terms of its reception with visitors, and the law enforcement, which is generally less positively regarded. People don't want to have to worry about getting a ticket. We're going to arrange those along fastest, cheapest, low-hanging fruit and deploy our expensive and sometimes unpopular law enforcement staff, not as our first option. Okay, so in 2010, when this case study was assembled, right, that means our boating and fishing regulations are going to be applied to the interior lakes, because as the National Park Service, we have control over the lakes in Voyageurs and not right outside, and there's a lot of them right outside. So the pressure of contagion is all around every side of the border, right? These little horrible little monstrous creatures are trying to get in from all sides, so to speak. We're trying to be brought in by visitors. So if we have to, we roll out a very, very direct limitation on use of you can't bring your boat because we can't be sure that your boat doesn't have any of these fleas on it. And that is a really, really intense move. But where you cannot afford to allow this non-native species in, because the Park Service is a preservation management orientation organization, that means we can put in a use limit like this. And it can be an early step, not a last resort. Okay? Not even any float plane landings, which is a super popular way to get around up here because there's not a lot of highways and so forth. And gosh, no live bait. I mean, that's a really, really harsh set of strictures. But the National Park Service, over the years, has become more and more consistent across all of its parks in helping all of the hundreds of millions of visitors each year understand, shoot, it's hard work preserving this place, and we need your help. We cannot do this without you. And you are half the entire reason, as a visitor, that we even exist. So we're going to get you in there every way that we can. We're going to have an amazing trip in a meaningfully, genuinely, highly protected ecosystem. And what that means are these following trade-offs, right? So you're putting in these rules and regulations, and then from minute one in the visitor center, People are seeing exploratory, explanatory, educational videos on, hey, these are the problems that Voyagers, these are the threats that Voyagers is facing. Won't you help us fight off these threats? And in doing that, we're going to require you to use a concession-provided canoe. Use a concession-provided motorboat or ferry boat, and so forth. And yeah, that's kind of an inconvenience. You can't bring in your own stuff. You got all your own gear dialed in. We know that. We do the same ourselves. But we just can't have everybody bringing in everybody's stuff. So we're all going to play nicely, and this is why. And when you explain to folks why, that you just don't have any wiggle room ecologically on these non-native invasive species, generally speaking, it transforms it from just like an arbitrary monkey on your back of a regulation to, okay, yeah, this is how we all are going to protect this together. All right, so using attributional language, you, we, I, us, our park to be protected. Okay? And as intensive as this is, the permitting system for getting a trip into Voyagers and enjoying that trip, like a multi-night thing, means that you're having those concessionaires segregate gear, right? This is a so-called clean room approach. So if you guys were computer science majors or IT majors studying to run major data centers, for example, at a lot of major data centers, dust is a real problem. So when you show up for work each day, you go into the locker room, you change out of the clothes that you drove into work in, and you get clean room gear on. Maybe put like boot covers over your boots and stuff like that, hairnet over your hair, scrub down your skin so you're not creating as much skin-based dust. Most dust is dead skin cells, and so forth, right? A clean room approach, because all that dust getting on all of those servers means a lot of extra heat and a much bigger bill for that data center. Same thing is kind of true here. So if we have only these boats going to only this lake because this lake has observed cases of non-native invasive species incursion, and those boats never get to go to this other lake over here, we're going to use maybe a different model of boat, even a different color of boat. So visibly, instantly, a patrol ranger can see this boat belongs on this lake because it's one of the blue boats, and this is our blue boat lake versus the red boat lake, and stuff like that, right? So we're doing things like that to sort of make the process of this clean room approach out in the wilds of northern United States, southern Canada, as workable as possible, right? So drying gear for 5+ days to desiccate out any of those aquatic insects and so forth, or arthropods. Not boiling our water for drinking, or not just boiling our water for drinking, but also cleaning our gear in boiling water for a minute plus, right? Think about all the stuff that you took on summer camp, for those of you who took summer camp. How much of a pain in the butt would it be to immerse all of those things individually and separately into your cook pot, which is full of boiling water, and how much of your stuff is plastic? And not a plastic like nylon that can handle 500 degree Fahrenheit heat without deforming. And water's only boiling at about 210 degrees Fahrenheit at Voyagers, right? So nylon's gonna be fine, but a whole lot of other plastics are gonna get melty in your pot. So this is a huge, huge logistical lift to make sure that all of everything can be sterilized in this way. And that means a lot of restrictions on the kind of gear you can use, right? Pulling out your fishing tackle box and going through it with a fine-tooth comb, not literally, but making sure that you don't have any hitchhikers in the nooks and crannies of a tackle box, which has a million little nooks and crannies and a whole bunch of stuff that looks like aquatic invaders, right? Bait. And inspecting boats, draining water. So it's a lot. And then also with information and education, we have massive lift on communicating the why and the wherefore of all of these things, right? So not just what are the rules, but this is why we are asking and requiring everybody to do all of these things, right? So every point of contact. We found in some research along these lines, not at Voyagers, but at many other places like it, other national parks, that the latency effect, the time span after you deliver a message to people on a trail, at a boat ramp, in a visitor center, you're typically measuring that in seconds. And then after that latency period has gone by, the person needs a repetition of that message, maybe in a novel form to keep it interesting, or surprising, or new, maybe just a pure repetition, right? So this is why, if you have ever been on a trail that has a sign, don't go off trail here, on this little side trail that visitors have created and trampled stuff. And that's the same sign 50 yards down with the next trail going sideways, the next trail, the next trail, the next trail. That's why that message repetition is so important, right? We're not here to read a bunch of signs. We're here to look past the signs and take in the beautiful landscape and enjoy our hike, or enjoy our float, or whatever it is. And so we have to just keep beating on the drum of explaining what these rules are, what they're going to look like for you on site in the moment of temptation, and why we have them in place. Okay? So, we've all seen signs like this. Every word on this sign, every color, every symbol, the font, the layout, the spacing, the kerning between letters, all of this stuff is carefully researched and brought to bear on every one of these signs. This is an MDNR sign, not a national park-based sign, but the practices are basically the same. The order of how things are presented, the size of the text in how things are presented, all of this stuff is done on purpose. The good news is you don't have to have a PhD in semiotics or communication science to put something like this together. The National Park Service runs an entire service center full of experts at Harper's Ferry in West Virginia, which is a National Park Service site, as well as a whole collection of specialists who help you design, fabricate, and install all of these signs, right? So each one of these signs might be, $1,000 to produce and another couple of $1,000 to install on site, and then another $1,000 to remove and replace when the sign's worn out and stuff like that. Like, you don't have to be an expert in all of this stuff. You have resources to lean into with all of these. It's a real pleasure working with these folks. So, for example, if you do like designing stuff like this, so information design is a thing. If you like doing woodworking with hand tools, the National Park Service is required to repair and restore any historic structures using period-accurate materials, tools, and techniques. So when we were at C&O Canal National Historic Park on summer camp this past year, there were wood shingled roofs. Those shingles were shaped or produced, manufactured, literally handmade, manufactured in Harper's Ferry, and then sent out and installed by experts flown out from Harper's Ferry to there, or probably just driven. Harper's Ferry is pretty close to DC. Anyway, so yeah, if you like geeking out on any like niche part of park management, or even forestry more broadly, there is probably a shop like at Harper's Ferry for you. So you could be a world level expert in how to build 18th century structures. And you develop that out of a love for forestry and out of a love for maybe woodworking, right? And you can get paid to do that. Very cool stuff. It's not very high visibility, which is why I'm bringing it up, but it is very, very cool. And you're working with a bunch of people who are world level geeks on this stuff as well. Like, that's a pretty rarefied crew to be able to do stuff with. Okay, on the law enforcement of it, so again, this is going to be our not first option, generally speaking, in terms of expense and in terms of preference or acceptability among visitors and what they'd like to experience or receive. We can hand out tickets, right? Sometimes being a park ranger, at least on the law enforcement side of things, is colloquially referred to as writing tickets in paradise, right? People still want to speed in national parks. People still want to be asshats and play their Bluetooth speakers late at night in the campground in national parks, right? People don't stop being people in national parks. So we need the carrot of all the positive stuff, and we need the stick sometimes, or often, consistently, with law enforcement, vehicle inspections, right? Kind of harsh and people's mellow, but for the inescapably important reason of keeping pathogens and non-native species out of these water bodies, at least in the case of voyagers. Okay? So let's talk about a couple of moderating factors for water. The bigger the water source is, or the water body is, the more flexible it is, and meaning more resistant and resilient it is to impacts. So a tiny little alpine pond can't handle but a few people a year swimming in it before it gets sterilized from sweat and sunblock and bug dope and fecal coliform washing off the body and the plume and so forth, right? But like Lake Powell can probably handle more than a few people swimming in it per year, right? The solution to this pollution is dilution, and bigger bodies of water are just better at it and always will be. When we are looking at, and this is a video taken here in Carbondale at a Green Earth facility. So this is a stone-capped creek crossing, and this keeps the soil, which is very erosive in this high slope, high flow stream bed area, keeps the soil where it is by making the soil bulk density extremely high, right? We're replacing we're capping the ambient soil with stone, coarse fragments, which are the highest bulk density soil particles you can possibly have, right? They're stone. Very heavy, they're not going anywhere, versus a smaller soil particle, which might want to go somewhere after you step on it. So we have people step on the stones. Now, this is not an automatic silver bullet quick easy fix. Stone work is hard, and there are some construction techniques and design techniques that you need to become aware of if you ever join a trail crew doing stonework. Not least of which is you need to manage friction and traction, right? Wet stones to cross a creek bed could be slippery. And then at that point, we're not just dislodging soil particles, we're dislodging people. That's not good. So, by virtue of installing these features, you are designing, constructing, and thereby representing to your visitors that this is a safe and effective spot and way in which to experience this location. So it has to be safe, it has to be effective. Okay? Moving on to water body best management practices. You have to closely monitor water bodies with the less outflow. For something like Campus Lake, the outflow, the sluice gate, the overflow for Campus Lake, it's tiny relative to the size of Campus Lake. And so what that means is any neurotoxic cyanobacteria contamination in Campus Lake is going to show up, get more concentrated, get more concentrated, get more concentrated, right? So rainwater is coming in, rainwater is evaporating out, there is hyporheic discharge or recharge. So the soil underneath Campus Lake, pulling some of that water down through the soil, for example. And cyanobacteria is going to be a problem again in Campus Lake because we're not constantly flushing Campus Lake. We're not constantly re-diluting it with huge influxes and outflows of water to dilute that toxin. Okay? So alpine lakes are a huge primary candidate for this. You gotta send field stuff out there to get grab samples from those little alpine ponds and lakes often, and then have the water chemistry lab to back it up. Like Williard and Schoonover run a water quality lab here on campus. This is one that all of us have experienced. The facility is greater than 75 meters, which is long distance from open water. People congregate, they spend time, they slow down, and bacteriologically at least, they're going to contaminate an area with facilities. Now, backcountry facilities are pretty much going to be campsites and trails, right? So that means you can't have trails within, what, 225 feet, 230, 40 feet of open water? That's a long way to keep a trail away from the spot that we all came to see. So what this means practically is we may have a lot of visitors creating visitor-created trails from our facility, which is Leave No Trace certified, kept far enough from open water to contaminate much downslope there. To visitors taking a hard right or left turn off of the designed, constructed, sustainable trail straight down towards the water, and that is a low trail slope alignment angle. And now, maybe in multiple places around this lake, we have essentially gullies opened up by boots or hooves or wheels straight down into the water, right? So this is tricky. This is very tricky. And the reason why I'm not providing more specific sort of ways to get through this is that every single site is going to be different. Okay? And finally, limit, harden, or elevate water crossings. So that is this, the water crossing that we just saw. And in backcountry sites, we've talked about privies, so we won't spend too much more time on that. We've got the cat hole technique, which is super basic. We just deposit it on the surface and maybe smear it out, have the UV sunlight, get rid of it. It works okay. It's not very pleasant, so compliance is an issue. With the cat hole technique, we are relying on soil microbes to neutralize the offensive smell and neutralize the bacterial component of those feces, right? So composting bacteria sort of take over and get rid of it. The science on cat holes, like somebody had to do these studies, poor bastard, found a couple of things. Depth does not matter as long as you don't have people digging well down beyond the organic soil, topsoil layers that are biologically active. If they're getting down in the B and C horizons, the mineral soil layers, which don't have any live action happening in them typically, then that feces deposit is going to be there kind of forever. It may even form what's called a coprolite, or a feces-based mineral formation. Coprolite. And especially if the soil is relatively thin on organic layers and or cold, right, those feces are going to be around a long time. The extreme example of this is going to be feces deposition in glaciers. So typically it's a pack it in, pack it out approach for glaciers, for anything above tree line, and so on and so forth. Okay, cool, moving on. Let's skip vault pit toilets, we already talked about this. Composting toilets are a lot of work. They're awesome. They sterilize stuff, they provide fertilizer nearby, pretty cool stuff. There's some drop-in systems that are okay. But the problem is you're basically running a bioreactor. This is a feces vat that you are curating the microbiology of, the microbiome of, and part of the year it's just not going to work in some places if it gets that cold. If the actual use outstrips the capacity, then you have what's called a runaway system, right? So if we're digesting 50 poops a day and we're getting 85 poops a day, then every day we're netting 35 extra poops. And these composting toilets, as you see, they're not very large physical structures. And so at that point, somebody has to get in there and muck out the surplus and put it in like an extra maybe tank to the side or worry about a pump system, and then people's tampons and wet wipes clog the pump impeller, and it's a disaster, right? So these are awesome when they work. When you have the resources, when you have the organizational capacity and the will to run these bioreactors in the form of composting toilets, very cool stuff. Very cool stuff. But it's kind of a glass cannon approach for those of you who play MOBAs. A glass cannon approach. Powerful, but not robust. Or you could hotbox it. And I'm trying to insert drug references, which were so much funnier back before Illinois legalized things. So a hotbox composting system relies on a very different bacteriological pathway. You basically have controlled decomposition and digestion of the feces, which runs the system up to about 150 degrees. And in larger systems like major farms, lodges, like Yosemite, I believe, these are high maintenance systems, but they're high throughput systems as well. It's kind of the jet engine of dealing with human poop. The conversations we have in this class. All right. And it is pretty cool stuff. You get 4 tons per season of solar sterilized, pasteurized end product spread on gardens at Yosemite headquarters. The problem is when you are dealing with human feces, if you don't perfectly pasteurize or sterilize it, like if there are prions left in it, we're collecting, concentrating those pathogens, hopefully all of which we kill, or denatured in the case of prions. But if we don't, we're spreading that concentrated stuff nearby, on site. So, where some people occasionally get sick from manure fertilizer spread on things like spinach, it gets into the grocery system. That's an issue. Where we're doing this on a much more bespoke level, a smaller scale, at a national park individually, or a particular site within a national park. In that case, we could get into real trouble. We could get a lot of people real sick real fast if this goes wrong. So this is the kind of high-touch, high-maintenance system that only the most major of the national parks is really going to mess around with. Okay? Cool. All right. Let's see here. I think we can skip the hands-on mini workshop of your professor demonstrating how to squat over a cat hole, right? I mean, it goes about how you'd expect, but we also want to think of this as unusual angles, unusual postures. If you're not accustomed to wall sitting, for example, this could be, a bit of a workout, even gymnastic. And I would hate for anybody to get surprised by their own, fireworks. So we'll just take that one for done for now. Any questions, comments, verbal abuse on water resources in recreation management? The impact dynamics thereof, biological, chemical, physical, non-native invasive species transport, or the management of those impact dynamics? All right, cool. Let's take a quick break. I'll cue up the vegetation stuff. And let's get lined up for the Thanksgiving break.